So here we have a worksheet hands-on experiment to do with our theme unit on matter. And we're looking at, with matter, some forms of matter, whether it has the ability to sink or float, whether it's buoyant, meaning it can stay afloat. So it says here for the summary, we're going to use free play and directed challenges to explore concepts of sinking and floating. So we're going to have a bunch of materials, a bucket of water, and then lots of different things that we can put into that container of water. So here's some of the objects that we're going to put into our water container to see whether they sink or float. We've got a pencil, a crayon, a marble, a screw or nail, a toy car, a styrofoam ball, a wooden block and another longer piece of wood, a piece of Lego, an empty tin pop can, a little plastic boat, some scrumpled up paper, a rock, and a sponge. And we'll test each one of those out to see whether they're going to sink to the bottom of our container or float. We're going to use a big silver container like this that we'll put water into. If you were to have something like a fish tank or a big glass bowl that you could see through the sides, that would probably be even better. But for our purposes, we're going to use this big tin foil container. It's waterproof, so the water won't leak out of it. And on the back side of this worksheet, it says draw objects that are floating or that have sunk to the bottom. Here we can see the water's on top, and here's our container. And it's going to ask us, what did we observe? So let's do our experiment first. So here is our container of water. So let's try a little plastic boat. Let's see if that'll float. Oh, look at that. There it is on top of the surface, floating around, doing what it's meant to do, which is to be a little boat floating. Well, let's try out our nail or screw and see whether they sink or float. Here we go. Oh, straight to the bottom. They both sunk. And we've got our empty pop can. So this one's empty, which means there's air inside of this can right now. Let's see if it sinks or floats. Oh, it's floating. What happens if I were to remove the air by filling it with water? So the water will take over where the air was. So now the tin can is full of water. The air has been removed, or most of it. It's quite a bit heavier in weight. Is it going to sink or float? Still floating a little bit. Not as much though. So the water is making it a little less buoyant. What if we try a crumpled up piece of paper? Will it float or sink? What do you think is going to happen? Well, look at that. It's floating. There we go. It's floating on the surface. Let's try a rock. What do you think is going to happen? Float or sink? Oh, straight to the bottom. It's down to the bottom. It is a sinker. Let's try a toy car. Will it float or sink? Oh, straight down to the bottom. It's a sinker. How about this sponge? Will it float or sink? Oh, it's floating right now. What if I got it wet completely? Will it float or will it sink? Even wet, it's still floating. Here I have a block of wood, and here I have a thinner, longer piece of wood. Will they both float, both sink? What's going to happen? Oh, look at that. This wood is buoyant. They're both floating. Here I have a pencil. Float or sink? Oh, it's going to float. Here I have a crayon. Will it float or sink? Ah, it's a sinker. Went straight to the bottom. How about a marble? Will it float or sink? Straight to the bottom and really fast. It's a sinker. What about a piece of Lego? Float or sink? It's going to float. And what about this styrofoam ball? Float or sink? Styrofoam's very light, so it floats right to the top easily. Can I make it sink? Let's push it down. Oh, right back up it goes. It won't stay down. Okay, we're also going to try one other experiment. In this case, we're going to use a piece of tin foil, and we're going to use a piece of modeling clay. I've taken a piece off already. What I want to do is I want to find out, is this modeling clay, is it going to float or sink? Oh, sunk straight to the bottom. What about this piece of tin foil? Let's just hold it a little smaller. Is this piece of tin foil going to sink or float? Oh, it's going to float. If I put the piece of modeling clay on top, oh, I can get it to hold that modeling clay up. In fact, I could probably even build myself a little boat. There we go, now I've got a little boat. I can put my modeling clay in, get it to try and float. I need a flatter bottom on this boat. There we go. So something that would sink can now float. What if I took the piece of tin foil and I pushed it into a really tight ball? Will that sink or float? Oh, look at that, it still seems to float. So we can see all of our different items that float, some of our items that sink. What we could say that we've learned about floating and sinking is that heavy objects that are very dense, there's no air in here, it's very solid and it's heavy, like the marble, it's going to sink. Same with this toy car, right? It's heavy, it's going to sink. And this crayon, it's also heavy and it's sunk. Whereas things that were lighter weight and spread out, like this piece of wood, floated. Or things that had air trapped inside them. There's lots of little air bubbles inside this sponge, and it's very lightweight. And there's lots of air inside this can. Even a little air inside this can will cause it to float. And the same kind of happens with the scrunched up piece of paper or the scrunched up tin foil, is that because there's lots of air trapped in between all these spaces, and because it's light in weight, it floats. So we can say that light things float, heavy things sink, but also if light things have air trapped in them, they can also float. Alright, so taking a look at our worksheet, let's draw some of those objects. Let's think of some of the ones that floated. There was the long piece of wood that floated. It was pretty thin. There was the block of wood that floated, although it sort of floated on its side, didn't it? There was the big styrofoam ball. That one floated. There was the sponge. That one floated. What thing sort of sunk though? Well, we had the rock, that sunk. And we had the toy car. That one sunk. And we had the round marble. That one sunk. And we had the crayon. That one sunk. whereas the pencil, it floated. And the little piece of Lego, that floated. And the crumpled up piece of paper, well, that one floated as well. Although I wonder what would happen if that paper got wet, and the wetter it got, whether it would sink. Those are some of the objects that we tested out. Add a little color. So we can say, what did we observe? What did we see? I guess we could say we saw that heavier objects sunk and lighter objects floated. So let's write that in. Heavy objects sink, light objects or things float. And there we go. That's our lesson on objects that float and sink.